people. We desperately need more. '23, that's barely progress. All right. Did something special happen yesterday that everybody's late? Some kind of live broadcast?
I don't think so.
Sorry, what?
I don't think so. I don't know.
Okay. There's no live stream of some kind of giant event that I'm too old to understand, that everybody watched.
No, but we do have a final exam after this class.
That explains.
So I don't know, maybe some people decided to, I don't know, do something else.
Well, they shall not be forgiven. Good. Let us start, dear students. Today, we're going to talk about ecology. And we're going to talk about that because the course has more or less ended, right? At least the history of political thought ended in my last class. We reached the battle between la izquierda y el neoliberalismo, which is still being fought out today, and it will be too tomorrow, right? This is the present situation. And thus I would, or could, end the course there, because there's nothing to go further in the history of political thought. But I don't want to end the course. Therefore, we have to now go to the future, right? If there's no more history of political thought, you might wonder, well, what's the future of political thought? And I want to talk about that because in the future, we have these major challenges that come at us. And I want to discuss them with you for two reasons. First, because you should know about these things. And I don't trust my colleagues that they will teach you about this. So I want to. And second, because these challenges more or less help you reflect about everything that you've learned so far, right? They challenge the history of political thought. These challenges are things that the ideologies that you learned so far do not necessarily have an answer to, because they were made in a time when these type of problems were not even conceivable, right? When Adam Smith wrote about capitalism, he did not have an idea of robots. He didn't understand that concept. Just like when I know Machiavelli was writing about things, he did not have an idea of ecology, right? So these ideas were made without these challenges in mind. Now I want to talk about what happens if they crash into each other. So I'm going to talk about two things. I have more things to talk about, but we don't have the time. So the two I selected, I want to talk about ecology today, and next time I want to talk about robots. So today we talk about the hard case. We talk about ecology. All right? So what is ecology, dear students? Ecology, the word ecology, right, comes from eco and logos. Eco is still the environment, the household, the thing that's around us. And logos is knowledge. So this is the knowledge of our environment, or better said, the knowledge of how we interact with our environment. That is ecology. Now we today are going to use it, of course, in a natural environment sense, right? But you could also talk about your social ecology or something like that. But that's not what we're doing, right? With the environment, we mean the natural environment, how we interact with it. And knowledge of how we interact with the natural environment became very important in the last 70 years, or the last 60 years. And that is because we now live in the Anthropocene. And you might think, what the hell? Huh? I thought we lived in modern times. Yeah, well, we live actually in postmodern times. But those are historical eras. The Anthropocene is a geological era. It's not a stage in human history, it's a stage in the history of the planet. And that started in 1945 with the use of the first atom bomb. From that point onwards, something new happened in the history of the Earth. These little small intelligent monkeys that lived on it now had the capacity to destroy the Earth. We never had that before. Since 1945, we actually can blow up the Earth itself. And thus humans from there onwards have the capacity, unfortunately, to influence Earth itself, right? So how we interact with that becomes very important now, since we can literally destroy it. So from this grew a movement which we would call environmentalism. Right? Environmentalism is a political movement that strives for the protection of the natural environment. So you can see how these three concepts kind of come together in environmentalism. Now, what's my angle in this lecture? My angle is that if you truly understand what I'm about to explain, if you truly grasp ecological issues, that will fundamentally change, or you will see how that fundamentally changes politics. How it will change all modern political thought and practice. As Naomi Klein says, this changes everything. Right? That's the title of her book on capitalism and the environment. If you truly grasp the ecological challenge, nothing can be the same. Okay, so let's dive into it. Let's see if any specific problems. There's going to be 3 parts to my lecture. Number 1, I'll introduce you to ecology in case you had no clue what it is about. Number 2, we're going to talk about these challenges to politics. And number 3, we're going to talk about solutions to the problem. But today, right now, we start with the problem, right? So introduction to ecology. Some of you might know a lot about this. Maybe some of you might know more than me. We'll see. But that's not the point. The point is that we all have a basic understanding of this. And one of the first things I want to tell you about ecological problems, that I want to tell you about the environment, is that not all ecological problems are the same thing. People sometimes think this. They think that nuclear energy is somehow related to climate change, and that climate change is somehow related to, I don't know, using metal straws, while these 3 things have nothing to do with each other, right? And so there are hundreds of different problems, and I'll keep explaining this to you if you have me in later courses. But we can group them in 2 big categories. You have, on the one hand, you have problems that have to do with people doing direct damage to the natural environment, right? Your actions have the direct visible consequence nature worse. That's one group of problems. Then we have another group of problems where my actions do not have a direct visible consequence, yet they will contribute to potentially destroying nature as a whole, right? This is a lot harder to grasp than the ones that are direct. My lecture is about the indirect ones, so let me quickly go over some of the direct problems, right? Direct damage to the environment. This again comes in many different forms. You could simply manually destroy nature by taking an axe and chopping down trees, or by engaging in activities like daytime mining, for example, open mines. Open mines is when you scratch off the surface of the earth because there's something right below there, right? If you mine for tar sand, for example, or for coal that's directly below the surface. That's called open mining. You literally destroy the surface of the earth, right? That obviously destroys nature because that's what you're scraping away. But you can also have activities that, through what they do, not directly, but they still damage the ecosystem, right? Air pollution is an easy example of that. But also leaving trash in nature, or things like acid rain. Acid rain is when industrial smoke produces a lot of acidity in the air, and that will gather in clouds. And when those clouds rain, they will rain acid, which when it falls on nature, on plants, for example, will erode them because the acid will eat into them. That is not a pleasant thing, right? So here you're damaging the ecosystem through what you're doing. Now, sometimes you don't mean to do this, but it just happens as an accident, right? Your activity is not inherently bad to nature. It just goes wrong. We're talking about things like oil spills, like the pelican in my picture. He's covered in oil, or nuclear disasters, right? And lastly, you have a bunch of things that people can do where they go after, well, where they go after animals, right? When we cause the extinction of species, either through pollution or through hunting them. In the case of tunas, for example, which are not extinct, but they were about to go extinct 10 years ago. Rhinos, and of course, bees. Bees, the scariest of all things. If bees die, we are screwed because we need them to fertilize our food. But that is not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about today about the indirect damage. I'm talking, of course, about climate change. And I'm going to explain climate change to you. Now, some of you might already know this, right? You might think, well, teacher, why do you tell us such basic knowledge that every citizen should have? Because not every citizen has it. To my great disappointment, I learned that my students, on average, don't really understand climate change. Even when I have them in 9th semester and they're about to graduate, I once had a whole class who couldn't explain what climate change is. I'm traumatized by that, so I'm going to make sure you understand. All right. Climate change, right, actually is made of different problems. What we call climate change is part of a problem that's called global warming. And global warming instead, in turn, is caused by something called the greenhouse effect. So we have to first explain the greenhouse effect to understand global warming, and when we understand global warming, we will understand climate change. The greenhouse effect. What is a greenhouse? Does any of you know what a greenhouse is? I'm from the country, you're from the city, so I don't know if it will be so easy, but who knows? It's not a house that is green. That's a tip. Francisco, tell us please.
Well, as far as I know, a greenhouse is like this dome or sort of a dome that you have in order to trap heat and I mean in order to grow food in environments that would otherwise not be so optimal to grow food. You trap like the heat, you control the sunlight, you control the soil that's in it. So the greenhouse effect is us generating gases that go into the atmosphere, and so the heat of the sun gets trapped inside. It's not able to bounce back into space.
Yes, indeed. So a greenhouse is, you can make it out of plastic, but typically it's a glass construction where you have the following effect. The glass lets sun rays through, but they also have a harder time escaping through the glass. Therefore, the heat stays in the house, right? So what we do on planet Earth is that we have certain gases. We have certain gases that have the chemical property to reflect sunlight on the way up. The most famous one of these is called carbon dioxide, but you also have a methane, which is a lot more powerful. And this, what happens is the light comes to Earth from the sun, right? It goes through clouds, it hits the Earth, part of it gets absorbed, that's what we call heat, and part of it is reflected back into space. However, we have a layer now of these greenhouse gases, and they are going to reflect part of that sunlight back to Earth. So it's going to hit us twice, which means, and this is only part of the sunlight, right? Let's say it's 10%, I don't know which percent it is. But it means that we get slightly more heat than we normally would, right? We let less heat escape. More of the sunlight gets to hit us. And that's called the greenhouse effect, because that means that we will slowly but surely trap more and more heat in the Earth's atmosphere. And the more gases we have, the stronger this greenhouse effect is. And this, dear students, leads to a thing called global warming, which is the steady rise of average temperature on planet Earth. And this, again, has effects, right? This leads to climate change. It does basically does two things. One is that most of the Earth's surface is water, right? So most sunlight or most reflected heat is going to hit the water. And therefore the ocean will very slowly warm up, which has two consequences. Well, there's many consequences, but two main ones. One, it creates hurricanes. And the second thing, it's not a coincidence that there are more hurricanes than before. And the second thing is it melts the ice at the North and the South Pole. And therefore, when the ice melts, right, it becomes water. You know your basic chemistry, I hope. And as we have more water than before, so the sea level is going to rise. Islands will disappear and coasts will get flooded. On the other side, inside the country, when temperature rises, it's going to create drought. It's going to create deserts, right? There are a lot of spaces that are on the edge of being a desert. Take, for example, Sonora. Sonora in summer gets 52 to 56 degrees. That's insane, but that's just enough to be fertile, right? And it's agricultural state. It is fertile, but it's on the edge, right? If you create 2 more degrees of temperature rise, we're kind of screwed, right? We were in desert levels. So from the outside of the country, the sea is rising. From the inside, the desert is growing. And so we have less and less land we can live in, right? And that's a big problem. So that's global warming and climate change, right? Climate change are the consequences of this global warming, which comes with extreme weather effects, hurricanes, etc. Now, I don't know if there are many climate change deniers in the room. Are there any open Trumpian climate change deniers here? I'm sure there are, they just don't want to say it. Well, in case they are, I'm still going to talk to you, right? I'd want to make sure that this is not happening in my class. So let's go to some common arguments of people who are against climate change. First of all, some people flat out deny it. It's a hoax. China made it up. It's not happening, right? As the orange man said. Well, some people think there's no climate change because it snowed last year, or because, you know, in New York it was cold. Well, we're talking, of course, about average temperature on Earth, right? The temperature is not the same. You have all kind of local variance. There's a different temperature here in San Pedro as there is in Santiago, right? So you have local variety, but we're talking about average temperature on the planet as a whole, which means that some places are a lot more hotter than they used to be, right? We have a 1 degree average rise in temperature, and you can see that, by the way, in the data of any big country over time, even if you have local variance. But this is not a coincidence, right? This is not just a random thing. If you look at the history of temperature, of the last 18 years, 17 have been part of the hottest 18 ever. Yeah, I hope you understand what I just said. So of the last 18 years, 17 have been in the top 18 or top 20, I think, hottest years ever, included the hottest year ever, which was 2016. So that is not random, right? That's a chance of 1 in millions for that to be random. If you don't understand it, just read this again and take a look at this nice graph I have. But you might say, it's a hoax, the Chinese, right? It's a giant lie, everybody's lying to me. Well, let's say that is true. Okay, but I want you to understand just how big of a lie this is, if it is a lie, right? Because where does this temperature come from? Temperature is measured in meteorological institutes. Those are used to predict the weather. There are thousands, if not 10,000s of those on planet Earth. Most of them are public. You could, in case you doubt the Mexicans, if you think, just like you think coronavirus is an invention of AMLO, maybe you think climate change is too. You could go to these meteorological institutes. They're public places. You could demand them to show you the data. I've done this once. Well, I didn't go for that, but I did go to Meteorological Institute, to their archives. And the clerk there told me that people ask him all the time to prove climate change. And well, he does, because he has the data. So you could do this if you're paranoid, right? Also, even if you don't trust this data, you're actually using it, because this data is used to predict the weather every day again, right? So if you look on your phone what the weather is going to be tomorrow, you apparently do trust the data on climate change, because it's the same data, all right? But you say, yeah, it's okay, the climate is changing, but it's not us doing it, right? I believe in climate change. I just don't think that we're contributing to it. It's another stupid thing you could say. Well, why would you say that? Because you probably don't believe that carbon dioxide has this property, right? But that's simply an empirical fact. If you test carbon dioxide in a laboratory, it has the effect that it can reflect radiation, just like other materials have other effects and properties. Yeah. And that we are producing this is beyond question. For example, we produce it mainly by burning coal, right? Well, not mainly, but that's one of the clearest contributors. There's some people, Trump, who somehow want to make you believe that burning coal doesn't cause carbon dioxide, right? He talks about clean coal. This is ridiculous. Coal, in Spanish, carbón, is predictably made of carbon. Yeah, that's in the name. Coal is carbon. And what is burning coal? What is burning something? Burning, combustion, chemically, means that you bind an element with oxygen. The process of binding something to oxygen is what we call burning. So if you burn carbon, bind it with oxygen, you predictably get carbon dioxide, right? It's CO2. So this is simple. If you deny this, you have no basic understanding of chemistry. And we, of course, are the source of that. You could say, yeah, but there are other things that cause carbon dioxide. For example, breeding does, or swamps do, and that's true. But the natural sources of carbon dioxide are part of a cycle, right? Called the carbon cycle. Plants breathe out oxygen and breathe in carbon. Animals breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon. And, in the cycle of life, this more or less is in balance. We add tons of carbon dioxide to this cycle via combustion of burning stuff, right? So this is not actually in balance, and we did cause that imbalance. But then there are some people, dear students, who would say, yeah, I know, but hey, the climate, it always changes, it's so out of our hands. Plus, it happened before. Even some people have the nerve to say, you know what, teacher, I have a theory, which means you watched a 1-minute YouTube video. I have a theory that we're actually going to an ice age. It sounds very deep, right? If you say things like that. No, that's not true. Why not? Yes, climate has changed over time. But every time it changed, right, it was a disaster. Whole species went extinct when the climate changed, right? The ice age killed the dinosaurs, among other things. So this was disastrous, and it hasn't happened in the last 2000 years. Yeah, we had changes in temperature, but these were like the ice age was something like 5 years or something. This is not the same as what we're seeing now. Plus, every time that we know from geology, from studying the layers of the earth, that the temperature rose, we know there was more carbon, right? Because I know a volcano erupted and pushed carbon into the air. So we know there's a relation between rising temperature and carbon. And we also know that we have emitted more carbon than ever before. Don't believe me? Watch some evidence. Here you have the carbon cycle on a geological scale. So at the bottom you have thousands of years, right? At the end you have the year zero, when Christ appeared. As you can see, there's a rhythm to this, right? It's called the ice age cycles. That means carbon goes up, temperature goes up, carbon goes down, temperature goes down. And there is a rhythm to this. However, we right now are on our way up, right? But we are beyond the normal up. See, the normal up lasted until the year 1700, and it was supposed to go down again in a normal cycle, but it didn't. Instead, it doubled since then, right? Since industrial times, levels of carbon dramatically increased. So as you can see, we are not in some natural cycle. We broke the natural cycle of things. And thus, we have a higher rise of temperature than ever before. And almost all scientists, except those paid by Shell and British Petroleum, agree with this. So climate change is real. Stop doubting it. Now, after angrily lecturing you on this, let us move on and back to politics. Right. I wanted to talk about politics as normal. If you remember, the claim of my lecture is that, oh, by the way, well, the claim of my lecture is that if you truly understand climate change, this changes everything. It changes politics as normal. It disrupts our normal understanding of politics. But before I move on, do you have any questions about the science of climate change? I'm not the biggest expert, but I'm an informed adult. So, or do you object to anything? Miss, you know, you're going to deny climate change. I hope not. Oh, not so far, she says. Okay, good. In case you are still not convinced of the reality of climate change, I have more info for you, right? Not now, but I have it. So talk to me. I have patience and time for you. Part 2, climate change in politics as normal. I say there are these challenges. Mainly, I think there are 3 challenges. 3 things that fundamentally change politics. The first one has to do with the scale of this event, right? The gravity of climate change. Climate change is different than other problems we faced before, such as a lack of freedom or things like that, because it is potentially apocalyptic, right? It is a doomsday problem. Why? Because it will destroy large parts of nature, of which we are, of course, part. And if you have increased deserts and also more water, and if that keeps going, you will get less arable land, and therefore you will have less land that can sustain us, right? And okay, on Instagram you can watch about urban farming and all this stuff, but it's not in quantity, that's not serious, right? We actually need physical land to grow food on. And if that decreases, then we won't be able to sustain enough food for humanity. And we will be in trouble, right? We might die from that. But it can get worse because the greenhouse gas effect, right, means that we are building the greenhouse. But the greenhouse is not complete. Every 10 years we add a glass plate to the greenhouse. But at some point, the greenhouse will be completed, right? We will have built a mirror in the sky. And at that point, it doesn't really matter if we still pollute or not. because there is enough carbon dioxide in the air already. Even if we don't produce any more, it's already there, right? So at some point, this increase in temperature will become automatic once the greenhouse is completed. And thus we'll just have a linear increase of, no matter what we do, we will have a linear decrease of temperature on Earth, all the way to 70, 80 degrees. I don't know if we will go beyond that, but life on will just get boiled, right? Life on Earth will become unsustainable, unless maybe on the poles or for some kind of volcanic bacteria, but not for us, right? So it is potentially apocalyptic. And that goes beyond modern politics, because modern politics is about conflicts between interests, right? It's about, for example, class warfare. But class warfare is not an apocalyptic event, right? Or normal warfare. They're not apocalyptic events unless they are nuclear, right? But this is more than just fighting between people. This is the people against some external threat, right? Normally we're used to other people being the threat to our safety, but now it comes from the outside. And in modern political thought, we don't really have anything that takes that into account. The closest thing you will find in history political thought to this type of apocalyptic event are actually the early Christians, people like Thomas of Aquino, those people who were very concerned with Judgment Day, who were very concerned with Christ coming back and seeing that the earth is a mess and not allowing us into heaven, right? This obsession with redemption of humanity that these like first millennia Christian writers had. That's the only thing we have that's roughly comparable, because they're both all or nothing games, right? They're all or nothing scenarios, total redemption or total doom. Climate change is a bit like that, right? There's a kind of religious, very Christian quality to it. But besides that, we have no real political issue that is of this scale. So it affects everything and everybody, but I will notice it doesn't affect them equally, right? There is still an element of class warfare in here. Marx is relevant, even if he didn't write about that, because the poor are gonna die first. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, if you just look at how the earth is composed right now, the global south and really the global middle, they're the ones that are most vulnerable to climate change, and they're also the poorest countries, right? Countries like Honduras or Ethiopia are most vulnerable to this because they live in the driest or the hottest regions, right? Those are typically poorer countries. So if you have a 2 degrees rise in temperature, that will impact Ethiopia a lot more than it will impact Canada, right? Because Ethiopia will just become infertile. Also, within countries, poor people are more vulnerable to climate change, right? When the hurricane came, it swept away houses of poor people, not because the hurricane knows where poor people live, but because poor people are going to live in cheaper neighborhoods which naturally are less protected from troubles, right? If there's going to be a flood, typically the rich, as you know, they live on the hills behind me in San Pedro, they will not be affected. So there is some kind of inequality here still. Paulina asks, a friend to say the Paris Agreement is completely false. I first of all don't know what it even means for an agreement to be false. Only want money. Nope. And it's very corrupt. They say that it's good to just have the treaty. Is this true? Ms. Paulina, what do you study? Do you study international relations? Good. You will, if I still live here, if I don't get assassinated, you will have me in 2 semesters for a course called International Law. And we're going to read the Paris Climate Change Agreement in full. I've read it many times, and I'll let you form your own opinion on this. In my opinion, no, I don't think it's corrupt or false. If you read it, it's a very caring, kind of positive document. That is quite balanced in my opinion. and I don't see how it would help people make money. But maybe a friend has never actually read it. Okay, so it's a big problem because of the scale, right? It's also a big problem. This ties in a little bit to Paulina's question. It is a problem that we can only solve by working together. A lot of problems in history are solved by conflict, right? Like class warfare, for example. But other problems can only be solved by cooperating. And climate change is one of those, right? Like actually most of the problems I'm talking about are collaborative problems. The climate change is the clearest case. It's a very proper global challenge, and ecology in general. Why? Because cause and effect go beyond borders, right? If I'm Brazil and I cut down the entire Amazon forest, which Bolsonaro is slowly doing, that doesn't just affect me, right? That affects the total availability of oxygen on Earth and also absorbs the amount of carbon we can absorb. So that will affect other countries, right? It's not that simple, or I can be affected by things that I never caused. So that means that I cannot solve it just on my own, right? If I means a country, right? Let's take, for example, Cuba. Cuba is the greenest country on this continent. It has, I think it's one of the only countries on Earth that has a perfect climate score. But that doesn't help them, right? Because they still get hit by hurricanes each year caused by the rise of the water temperature somewhere else, caused by the Americans. And no matter how much they're energy neutral, that doesn't help them because other countries are doing this, right? So you cannot shield yourself from the consequences of climate change by you doing things right. Like you, in the case of a pandemic, can shield yourself by staying inside. You cannot do that with climate change. So you need other countries to be part of it too. It needs to be a group effort. And mainly that would come by regulating economic activities, right? Because it's the economy that's causing this problem. So the only way to solve that, unless we hope that magically the invisible hand is going to make everybody act right, is to regulate it. Is through agreements, through treaties, through laws, too. The Paris Climate Change Agreement. So we need to do things. Yeah. So this is a unique situation where we both have a very strong incentive to cooperate, because we're going to die if we don't. And at the same time, we have a strong incentive to free ride. Free ride means that everybody else is doing the right thing, you're going to do the wrong thing, and that's going to create an advantage for you, right? So, for example, in the case of coronavirus, we have a strong incentive to be good citizens and stay inside, if not wear a mask, because we might die. But there is also a strong incentive to actually break the rules. If you're in a competitive context, if everybody else is staying inside, that means that there's great opportunities for the people who don't stay inside, right? Very simple sense, you won't have to stand in a queue to go to a theme park, haha, because there's no people in the queue, right? So if you go, you're alone there. So there's also incentives to break the rules. And the same is with climate change, right? You have a strong incentive to, for example, move away from coal. Yet, if everybody moves away from coal, that means that coal is going to be super cheap. So if you're the only country that still uses coal, you have almost free energy, right? So there is an incentive to break away from the group that's roughly as strong as to stay with the group. And if we understand this, right, we understand this need for collaboration, that should make us rethink politics a bit. Because there's two things that modern politics, especially international relations, are based on that are not really sustainable from this point of view. One of them is the national scale. Most modern ideologies, with neoliberalism as a sort of exception to it, but most modern ideologies are nationally oriented, right? For example, socialism is about providing welfare to your people, right? AMLO doubled the pensions for Mexico, not for people in Vietnam, right? So you think this only works, socialism only works on a national scale, at least in the way we have it right now. But climate change is not national. As I just explained, there is no borders in the climate. So maybe we have to start thinking politics on a higher level. And most modern ideologies are not taught with a higher level in mind, right? Should start thinking about international politics, not international relations, because that's a relation between countries, but international politics proper, right? Also, we should think a bit about how these nations interact. Right now, the organizing principle of the world, thanks to neoliberalism, is competition, right? Inside countries, between people, between companies, but also outside countries. And that's not a neoliberal thing, that exists in fascism too, it exists in other ideologies, less in communism, but in most countries are competing with each other. But you cannot collaborate and compete at the same time, right? So both competition and national politics are things that we should think about. You can write that down to think about later after your next exam. So in a way, we need to come back to more a kind of Hegelian approach, where Hegel was talking about the world spirit, if you remember that from a while back, right? This idea of human civilization, of our ideas passing through us, and this kind of grander thing, this grander culture that we're passing on, that survives us. Well, that should be the focus, right? We have to start thinking about how can we make sure that the world spirit, that civilization itself, survives. And the last challenge, so we had scale, we had collaboration. The last challenge has to do with growth. Climate change fundamentally questions practically all modern ideologies because it questions growth itself. As we saw, capitalism, right, advances by exploiting people, we saw it with Marx, but also nature. Marx actually remarks on this, right? It's both man and nature. He's just not interested in nature, so he didn't write 4 books about it. But value is created by fusing work with nature. Both are exploited here. As you can see in this mine, right, this picture. So that leads to the question, is capitalism really compatible with ecology, right? Because capitalism has a logic of eternal growth. Capitalism literally is a system in which money is invested to make more money, right? The very goal of everything is accumulation. You might say, yeah, but what if we just don't do that, right? We have companies, but there's no growth. Well, that's still hard because the whole system is built on credit. It's built on debt, on investment, on loans, which means that the money that's invested needs to create more money, right? So kind of the system is just locked into this growth modus. And the question is that really compatible with ecology? Well, why would it not be? Because you have a system that's about infinite accumulation, but we live on a finite planet, right? There's only so much we can use, and there's only so much we can pollute because, it's limited. Also, this planet is alive. We cannot just treat it as resources on an Excel sheet, right? There's all kind of other consequences, right? If you have a ship that passes through a coral reef, then on the Excel sheet, you only see, oh, it costs us so much oil to go to the coral reef. But destroying the coral reef has all kind of other consequences, right? So you cannot just capture that in economic terms. And lastly, one of the problems with capitalism is that it creates this illusion of externalization. What's externalization? It's an important word for you to understand. Externalization, I think I explained this before with fascism, means that you have a problem and you are going to solve that problem by simply pushing it away, right? If I externalize a problem, it means that I make it no longer my problem. But the problem is still there, right? Very simple example, I have trash, I throw the trash outside my window. I have the window right there. The trash doesn't disappear, right? It just disappeared from my house, but it's not gone. Well, on a grand scale, we have this illusion that we can somehow externalize the effects of climate change, right? We deal with them by kind of blowing them away. We deal with trash by just dumping trash in some African country, and now there's no more trash here, right? It's not what actually happened, right? It doesn't actually disappear. Let me give you one very clean example of how we deal with things. So average temperature is rising, right? And a lot of homes, more homes than in the past, have air conditioning. Now I have a question for Miss Andrea. Are you there, Miss Andrea? Garcia. Muniz. Muniz. Are you amongst us? She's not. Well, Miss Astrid, are you there? Oh, Andrea is there. Andrea, does air conditioning cool or heat? It's a very simple question. It's a yes, it's a cool or heat question. Both. Okay, yeah, you think of a mini split. No, the answer is air conditioning heats. You might think, huh? But I put it on for the room to get colder. Yeah, but that's because of how it actually works. Air conditioning does not create cold. Air conditioning moves heat. That's all it does. There is no such thing as creating coldness. It's not possible. Because you only have heat and you can have less or more heat. There is no such thing as cold in the universe. So air conditioning does not create coldness. It moves away heat. It subtracts heat. It sucks out heat from an area. But to do that, it needs energy, right? So since it is moving heat, and since there's an engine that's producing heat, air conditioning actually creates heat. Air conditioning system has two parts, right? You have the blowing thing that's on your wall, and you have this thing that's outside your roof with the fan, right? If they were both in the same room, the temperature would increase because one thing would take out heat and the other one would then spew it out, right? But if they were both in the same room, you would boil. That's why they're in separate rooms. So air conditioning creates heat, not subtracts it. But we use that to deal with us feeling hot, which means that in total, if we all use air conditioning, temperature goes up, not down, right? That's why if you stand in a traffic jam, it's actually going to get very hot because everybody's the air goes on, but these air goes, they just heat, which then disturbs the airco of the car next to you, and that's going to spew out more heat, and you're all kind of screwing each other by doing this. Well, that's like how Earth works on a larger scale, right? We cannot just get rid of this by moving it around. It is a ball. We cannot, unless we shoot into space, we cannot just get rid of these effects. We can only try to avoid them in the first place. So now you know about air codes. So if we understand this, right, how does it interact with ideology? Well, in the case of neoliberalism, we have a very predictable interaction, right? Neoliberalism is very troubled by ecology. It does not really have a good answer to it. Why is that? Well, because the main cause of this whole problem is capitalism, right? Both in its productive capacity and in its overconsumption capacity. That clearly contributes to climate change. Not that other systems don't contribute to it, but climate change, but capitalism does it significantly more because it's about ever doing more, right? So that's the problem, because this ideology wants to increase capitalism. Also, this ideology has a refusal to let the state interact with problems, right? The state shouldn't do that. The state should just protect your rights, but not actually do things. So we are largely defenseless against climate change because there will be no regulation and there will be no help coming because that's not what the government is supposed to do. So we have an ideology that increases the problem and refuses to solve it. The only possible response neoliberals would have is this, again, faith in the market that I talked about, right? The idea that the market is going to create more efficiency and therefore we'll have better technologies, and those technologies are going to save us from the thing that is caused by the use of technologies, right? Technology is going to solve the problem of technology. We're going to fight fire with fire. And that's going to happen because the market will make that happen. That's their best response to this. Okay, you could have your faith in that if you're a neoliberal, but it's still a challenge, right? You need to actually come up with this answer. It's not a natural answer. Nationalism does have the capacity to act. It's not defenseless. However, nationalism and fascism have more problems with the collaborative part, right? They're not, unlike neoliberalism, they're not global ideologies. They have a focus on this international competition, right? And nationalism and fascism typically deals with problems by externalizing them. You have a problem with migration. Okay, we're just going to push these migrants to some other country. These migrants don't disappear. They just become some other country's migration crisis now, right? And the same goes with climate. Oh, we have too much stress. We'll just dump it somewhere else. That is of limited use to the bigger picture, right? So nationalism, because it's so competitive, and because it usually, in the case of fascism, deals with problems by pushing them on others, is not exactly hopeful here, or we have to at least rethink that, right? Plus, neo-fascism, Trump has a problem with science in general, right? So they kind of deal with this problem by attacking climate science itself. If you talk to Trump supporters, not all of them, but a lot of them will typically simply deny climate change because they know they have no answer to it. So if you have no answer to the problem, just pretend the problem doesn't exist. So that's bad, right? So the right wing of the political spectrum is not doing so well with climate change. What about the left? Well, socialism is also a bit troubled here. This is better, but not without its problems, because socialism is still built on the assumption of growth, right? Because socialism is built on taxes, and taxes are levied on economic activity. Therefore, you still assume that there will be economical growth. Unless you're AMLO and you can get this money by fighting corruption, but that is not a sustainable path, right? The plan is always for there to be growth. So socialism suffers in a lighter degree from the same problem as liberalism. Also, socialism, if it's successful, is going to reduce poverty, right? That's kind of the goal of the whole thing. That means that you will increase the living standard of people, which is good, but it also means you will increase consumption, right? And that comes with some ecological costs. So you have to somehow compensate for that. You cannot just have the old system again. Or can you? We'll discuss that later. So all ideologies are troubled. Communism, much less, because you can actually control the economy there, and you can deal with problems. Although communism typically also wants to grow, right? Still suffers from this last problem. So you can see how climate change kind of changes modern ideology, or at least challenges it from a new perspective, right? Instead of liberalism critiquing socialism, socialism critiquing liberalism, now we have this kind of third challenger that has entered the ring in this debate. So now let's use the last part of my lecture to talk about solutions, inconvenient solutions. If we talk about fixing climate change, most people are going to think about technology, right? Environmentalism equals solar panels, windmills. And if they're very uninformed people, they will think it relates to technologies that have nothing to do with this, like recycling, for example. Recycling is not about climate change. Neither are plastic straws, neither are any of these things. They're about trash, not climate change. But in general, people, you politicians, will talk about global warming in a technological sense. And this, let's start with that, right? The mainstream view focus on technological solutions that are more or less compatible with growth. They can either focus on energy efficiency. I think that's where most of the focus is at. So this means we're going to do the same thing with less energy, right? We're going to increase, we're going to improve energy. We're going to make engines more energy efficient. We're going to make production chains more energy efficient by reusing heat, for example, in a production chain. Okay, what else? Technology is also focused on changing not how much energy we use, but what energy we use, right? It's about changing energy production. The main fight here, the big one, what you probably really think of if you think of environmental policy, is a move away from coal to renewable energy, right? Coal is disastrous because it's literally carbon that you're just more than anything else creating carbon dioxide by burning coal. We want to move away from coal towards renewable energy. Water energy, wind energy, solar energy, right? Windmills, solar panels, and hydraulic dams or turbines in rivers. That's what we need to do. Now, if we cannot do that, or if we don't want to do that, there's another path. That is to move from coal to nuclear energy. That also works for climate change reasons. Nuclear energy is far more energy efficient than coal is. And fission does not create as much greenhouse gases as combustion does. So that could also do the trick. Problem with nuclear energy is that it creates a whole separate environmental problem, that of radioactivity, right? Which is not climate change, but it can destroy us in a different way. So that's a solution to this problem, but it's a cause of another one. But you could do it if you want to solve climate change. You could do it with nuclear energy. But that's about mainly electricity, right? We also need other forms of energy. So that's about finding alternatives to oil, whether that is electricity or whether that is other things we can burn that pollute less carbon dioxide into the air. And then there's a last set of technologies which are not about avoiding the carbon, but about kind of trying to repair the atmosphere. The most simple way of doing that is by filtering carbon dioxide. You have all kinds of machines that can do that, or you have these tanks with algae in them who can do that. The problem with this whole branch of technology is that we already have something that can do that. It's called a tree. So we're trying to endlessly reinvent the tree and get government subsidies for that. It's a bit weird to me. And then you have all kind of science fiction-y technologies about sucking the carbon out of the air, or about making the water of the ocean refract light back, or other kind of more fantastical technologies that people are thinking about. So this is the spectrum of technological fixes, right? Now, as you can probably hear in the tone of my voice, I'm not super enthusiastic about this. Not because I don't believe that it works, at least the first two. I understand enough of technology to know it does work. I don't think that windmills are a hoax. But I am not entirely confident in our ability to actually do this, or I don't think it is enough. Let me explain you why I have some doubts. Some background, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I have a master in science and technology studies. I studied the history of technology. I don't know why I did that, but I did that for 2 years. So I know a little bit about this, right? And one thing I learned from history of technology is that when people want to use technology as a solution for things, that's typically because they don't want to actually change things, right? The big appeal of technological fix, and why liberals like to talk about it and equate ecology with technology, is because it creates the idea that things are going to be all right while we keep doing things the way we do them, right? Things can just keep going. You can do the exact same consumption levels, just using different materials, and the market can keep existing. That's very typical of technological thinking, right? In science fiction in general, we think of a different technological future but socially everything is the same. You still live in the same communities, you have the same family relationships, you have the same work relationships, just the environment is totally different. Which makes no sense if you think about it, right? Think of Star Wars as a great example of this. You have Mexicans in Star Wars. It's ridiculous, right? This is a galaxy far, far away with six-legged humanoids and robots that can talk, and somehow there are still Mexicans. Right? What is Mexico even in this universe? So we kind of think the world totally different and then the same at the same time. I'm not a big fan of this. I don't think they're the same thing. Why is that? Well, first of all, when it comes to these kind of futuristic technologies, they simply don't exist yet, right? So believing in something that is not there, to me as an atheist, has a kind of fundamental irrationality to it, right? It's fate. It's like you have fate in the market, you have faith that we are going to invent some technology that will save us, although we don't know what it is, right? I rather have a plan than have faith, but that's me personally. Also, what I know from studying history of technology is that inventing a technology doesn't mean anything. It's not because you have a technology that has any effect. Let me explain this to you. A lot of technologies are older than you think they are. They just were not used like that. For example, gunpowder. The Chinese had it before the Europeans did. The Chinese just never built guns. The Europeans did. That's why we conquered the earth, right? The printing press. The printing press is not invented by Gutenberg. It's invented by Koreans. But they used it to print poetry for the king in Korea. They didn't use it for mass production of books, right? The Germans in World War II had better technology. They had even jet fighters. They just couldn't build them because they didn't have the material and the time to do so, right? So having a technology is not the same thing as having the effects of a technology, right? To have that, you need to actually stimulate its implementation, right? You need to mass produce it. You need to bring it to the people. As we saw in my class on communism, the electrical car was invented in the 70s. In the West, it was never in the interest of industries to actually do it, right? And we still don't have electrical cars as a mainstream thing because we also need to account for accessibility, right? You can have a great technology that nobody can afford or nobody knows how to use. Therefore, it's useless. You could as well not have had it. So inventing technology, the fact that we have the technology doesn't mean anything. You still need politics to use that technology. And in fact, if we're serious about it, a lot of the actual big things, the things that can actually make a difference, are megastructures. They're physically very big artifacts. For example, hydraulic dams are the most energy efficient form of green energy. You cannot just build a hydraulic dam, right? That will flood whole areas. The government needs to do that. You can privately build a hydraulic dam. That's madness. Things like windmill parks are very big. But also, if you talk about transport, right? For example, if you need a railroad network to replace airlines, right? Things like a Tren Maya, you don't just build that as an individual, right? Even if a private company would do it, you still need the government to clear the way for that. So a lot of these things, they don't just happen. It's not because they're possible that we're going to do them. If you want them to happen, you need political action that makes that happen, right? So technology in itself doesn't save, it just has the potential to do so. Plus, I am not entirely convinced of the path we are on with technology. We have this fascination with high tech, right? And high tech typically means more efficient technologies. But there is a difference between energy efficiency and energy use. That might seem contradictory to you and unintuitive, but hear me out, right? If we have more energy efficient things, right, that means we can do more with the same energy. Typically, we're going to do that. So for example, if you look at cars, the engines of cars got ever more energy efficient, right? Yet cars do not actually use less energy than before. How is that possible? Because cars got bigger and heavier and full of electronics. So your modern car a lot more energy than a Nissan Tsuru does, right? Even if the Tsuru has a far worse engine, but the Tsuru is basically a soda can with wheels, so it doesn't weigh anything. Like a few people could lift it up. You cannot just lift up a Mercedes Jeep, right? So we actually use the same or more energy with more energy efficient things because we can now make them bigger because they're more energy efficient. The same with TVs. TVs are more energy efficient. TVs are more energy efficient, but they also get bigger. So, and we start using them for things that we didn't use them for before. For example, to display the menu at a fast food place. Right? You could as well just write it on the wall. Now we have an LCD screen displaying that. That's only possible because it's more energy efficient, but we're using more energy because of the efficiency. Also, some things are use of materials that might require a lot of energy to make, right? Which is especially tragic if that technology has nothing to do with actual climate change, like straws, for example. And sometimes you can have a technology that might work, it's just too expensive in its current form. It's not actually a solution for the world. I like to criticize Tesla for this, right? Tesla is going to save us from the future, except that they are for rich people. So most people cannot buy it. And even if you buy it, doesn't mean you're actually using green energy because Teslas run on electricity. But what is the electricity made from? In the case of Monterey, it comes from diesel turbines. So Teslas actually use diesel. Think about that. So this is not necessarily a solution for everyone, right? Okay, I'm not going to keep going here, right? I say you should also think of other types of technologies, but that's a political question, right? What technology? My point in general is that I do believe in technology. I am not a denier of how it technically works, and I hope we get more of it. But we have to think beyond that. Just talking about how we do things does not replace the question what we do. It's not just a question of production, it's also a question of consumption. At the end of the day, we need to stop doing things, not pollute less things. We need to not do them. So what are the big things here when we talk about consumption? Well, there are three. And they're not things you like to talk about. They're going to scar you. You're going to be annoyed that I brought them to your attention. But we have to talk about them. The first thing we have to talk about is meat. Meat is a major contributor to climate change, to global warming. About 18% of all emissions, 18% of greenhouse gas comes from agriculture, and of that 80% comes from livestock, from animals. So in other words, if my math is not terribly off, that means that about 14 to 15% of emissions come from animals. Now, why is that? Because certain animals, not all, particularly animals that have hoofs, like sheep and goats and cows, produce methane. They chew a lot on their food. This creates a lot of methane gas. When they burp or fart, they create methane, and methane is 70 to 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide is. And people on the right like to laugh at this. The people on the left, they're talking about cows farting. Yes. Not because it's funny that it's not true, right? So hoof animals produce methane. Methane is terrible for climate change. But it's more than that. Growing meat in general is energy efficient because you have to feed the meat, right? Instead of us eating corn, we are now going to feed the corn to a pig for, I don't know, half a year. Then we're going to eat the pig. So we are using a lot of food to create other food, right? Which logically costs much more energy. And we have to transport it twice. We have to transport our food and we have to transport the food for our food. So you can start to understand how the idea that meat is a contributor to climate change actually makes a lot of sense, right? So what should we do about this? Well, we need to stop or increase in meat consumption. We eat more and more meat each year because people in communist countries are getting more money, like China. Oh, China's not really communist. Let's call it socialist countries. And therefore they can now afford meat. So meat consumption is going up. Well, we should obviously stop that, right? But it's very important to read that I wrote meat consumption. I didn't say we need to stop eating meat. This is very important. Vegans get this wrong all the time when they try to convince people for ecological reasons. Climate change is a chemical phenomenon, right? That means it's about math at the end of the day. We need to reduce numbers, not principles. We need to eat less meat, not no meat. Or we need to use different meat. Let me show you a graph. Not enough people understand this. Different type of foods have different carbon footprints, and that includes different meats. The worst things are, I don't know if you can see it, it's a bit small, but the worst are lamb and beef, cows and sheep. They have an enormous ecological footprint. But pork already has only half the footprint of beef. That means that for every kilogram of beef, you could eat 2 kilograms of pork. So eating pork instead of beef already reduces the problem by half. If you then instead would eat chicken, chicken has half the footprint of pork. So you can eat 4 kilograms of chicken for 1 kilogram of beef. You understand where I'm going with this, right? You don't necessarily need to stop eating meat. You just need to eat different meat, and that would already solve the problem. So it's not as scary as you might think, right? I'm not telling you should never eat meat again. I'm telling you if we want to take this serious, we should regulate meat consumption. How to do that? Well, you could simply raise the prices by stopping subsidies for them, or you could simply tax beef. That would be an interesting thing to do. You could also take a more, animal-friendly approach. That is, if you would increase the life quality of animals, for example, you give pigs 3 times more space to move around than they have now, that will make the production less efficient. That will naturally raise the prices of pork, right? Because you now need more space for the same amount of pigs. And when it raises the price of pork, people are going to eat less pork, right? So you kind of kill 2 birds with the same stone there. And we would, of course, need to change culture away from where it's heading now through government policy. So that's meat consumption. The true regios here hate me already for saying this and daring to attack the carne asada, but that is unfortunately the truth. And there are more things that are unfortunately the truth, dear students. One of them is that you should never fly an airplane again. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about air travel, right? Air travel. Air travel is the fastest growing cause of global warming. It's not the biggest. Combustion and meat are, but it is the one that's increasing the fastest. And it has a massive ecological footprint. Of all choices you could make, like individual choices, not consistent choice, not principles, but like in the moment choices, not taking an airplane is the single biggest consumer choice you can make that affects your ecological footprint. Okay. Going vegan is a bigger effect, but going vegan is, thousands of choices you have to make. But taking an airplane is the biggest single choice you could make. Why? Because the airplane uses a ton of carbon dioxide. Why? Because you're not just moving people, you're moving the airplane, and you're not just moving the airplane, you're flying the airplane, right? You're keeping this immensely heavy thing in the air that costs lots of energy. It also uses very polluting fuel, and it blows it directly into the atmosphere. If I produce carbon with my car, for example, if I'm driving to a forest, there's still a chance the forest is going to absorb part of my carbon, right? But if I pollute it directly into the greenhouse gas layer, which is what airplanes are doing, well, there's no chance of recuperating that. So airplanes are particularly troublesome from a climate change perspective. So if we talk just logic, right, from a global ecological perspective, one should simply not travel by air unless you need to. And you don't like that, but that doesn't make it less true, right? I don't like this either. Remember, I'm from another continent. But if you just put from an ethical perspective, you should not fly. And you don't like that. You don't want to hear this. You try to ignore this slide because you think traveling is cool, right? The coolest thing you could do these days is travel. If and when you guys travel, you're going to make thousands of pictures and make sure all your friends on Instagram know you traveled because it's cool. And those of you that don't travel, at least half of you follow some kind of travel blog, right? Of people who do travel, because that's part of our culture. But that doesn't make it true. Saving the world is not fun. It's about dealing with the apocalypse, not about having fun. So ethically, one should not travel unless you need to, at least by air. I, for example, don't travel by air unless it is to see my family once a year, but I don't. If I can drive, I will drive. If not, I simply won't go. So if we talk about policy solutions, then how would you do that? Well, you need to make air travel more expensive. Right? In Europe, air travel is, and in Mexico too, air travel is as expensive, if not cheaper, than going by land. That's the problem. So you could either decrease the prices of alternatives or you could raise the prices of air travel. You could, for example, make it a progressive taxation. That means that the first plane ticket you buy, there's normal tax. The second plane ticket you buy that year, you have to pay twice. The third ticket you buy that year, you have to pay 3 times the cost, etc., etc. So the more you travel, the more it costs. That means that you can still go to Hawaii on your once-a-year family vacation, but the guy that just because he has a mistress in California flies every weekend, right? He cannot keep doing that. Or you could simply ration air travel. You could say, okay, everyone can fly twice a year. And that's it. A communist government could impose that. Or you could, well, as I said before, build trains, for example, that would reduce this. That's a more positive answer to it. And lastly, the other controversial thing has to do with population, right? Population increase, of course, drives climate change because if there's more humans, there's going to be more consumption, right? At the end of the day, all of this comes from consumption. And there's more consumers means more consumption. But this, I think, is not actually the biggest problem. People think that to solve climate change, we need to reduce the world population, right? We need to call Thanos to come. That's actually not true. Contrary to what people believe, there is no exponential growth of the world population. Matter of fact, the world population is already guaranteed to decrease. So we're not gonna grow forever. That's because the birth rate is not increasing. The birth rate has decreased over time. You can see it in a little graph at the bottom. We now on average have 2.5 kids, which is exactly what we need to sustain the species without increasing it, because part of that is going to die before they have children. So the birth rate is already there, right? So how does it work? See, the teacher, that's not true because the world population is growing. That's true, but it's growing because people get older, not because we have more kids. And once the generation of my parents dies, that's a generation who has 6 brothers and sisters, global population will stop growing. And that's already guaranteed because my parents' generation and my generation have less children than the ones before us. So this is already gonna happen. This is 100% certain that world population won't keep increasing. But there's still 30 years till we reach that peak, right? For the next 30 years, it will keep increasing. The one wild card is if Africa strongly develops, maybe it starts increasing a lot more then. But for now, as things are going, that's not the case, right? But we still need to make it to those 30 years, right? For the next 30 years, indeed, there will be an increase in world population. This does make a difference how much kids we have, right? Because each one adds to this. Now, this topic is inherently controversial, right? For very good reasons, because you're politicizing babies. Yeah. And it's also controversial because typically the people who like to talk about population and overpopulation are typically more on the far right side of things. Because when they really talk about less people, they mean less poor people, right? This whole discourse of poor people have too much kids and look at these people in Africa and all these kind of things. But it's an empty argument because poor people are not actually contributing that much, right? You have to look at an individual's footprint. One rich person can have 100 to 1,000 times more ecological footprint than a poor person. So that poor person can have 10 kids and they still won't pollute 1% of what the rich person does. So, you know, it's not about numbers. It's more about which babies than how many babies. And it is a very intrusive discussion, right? If you would take a hard approach on this, you would limit the amount of kids people would have. China did this. This is, for good reasons, very intrusive, right? You're actually limiting reproduction. Nature is about reproduction. So this is very totalitarian, right? It's something that people, myself included, would be willing to die over if the government would tell me I could not have my child. So that's a very touchy discussion, right? And it's a bit of a weird discussion because population growth only matters if we don't want to do any of these other things, right? So sometimes people, and this whole idea that the Marvel movies popularized, right, of population control, is a kind of a weird avoiding of just doing the right thing and changing our habits. We rather have less people than change our own habits. It's very fascist, selfish logic to me. Now, how can we do this, right? So I already explained to you, the problem is less big than you think it is because we actually already solved it. We just need to survive the next 30 years. How can we contribute further to this in a way that is not fascist, that is not killing people, right? In a way that is fair. But one way is by using condoms. Haha, right? And it's very simple. By birth control, you reduce population. That's good. Also, we can do it by creating more opportunities for women. If women have a lot of children, it's typically because they don't have too much other things they can do at that moment. While if they can do other things, then the children have to compete with those other ambitions. So for example, by increasing education and empowering women, we're going to delay the time before women have children. On average, right? You can still choose to have children right now, and that would be very cool. But most of you, I think, don't have children, right? Although you are at the age that you could have children, but you don't because you're in school. So going to university kind of adds 5 years to the normal moment in which a family would start. Therefore, you can have less children in total. You don't have enough time anymore to have 10 children, right? You can only have 4 or 3 or 2 in the time you have biologically. So by increasing education, we're going to decrease birth rate. And as we kind of naturally, by doing good things, create good environmental effects. So I'm a lot more optimistic on population than I am on the other things. Now to summarize. Maria says there was a book that was about population growth. Yes, but in the 1960s, the population was exponentially growing because that's a generation where people had 6 kids on average. And well, that changed in the 80s for the good. But if things kept growing at that pace, yeah, we would be in trouble. And we are going to be in trouble because the population is still growing, right? We're going to have about 3 more billion people before it will flatten out this curve. So we still need to make sure we have space for 3 billion more people on this earth. Anyway, concluding, my point in this whole lecture is to first teach you about environmentalism in case you didn't know, but also that all political thought must adapt. Ecology, basically, in short, means the end of business as usual. Why? Because we can no longer think about politics just on a national scale, which is what, for example, social contract theory is about, right? It's about the theory of a contract in a society. Well, that doesn't work anymore. We need to also think of it on an international scale. We need to not just think about each other anymore. In normal political conflict, for example, class struggle, you have opponents, allies, and responsibilities towards people who actually exist, right? It's responsibility for people you can see. But with climate change, we have to think about people who are not there yet. We also have responsibility towards people in the future. It's just a whole new concept, right, in ethics that we're not used to thinking about. Also, in ethics, normal ethics means that you have a rule about doing good that applies equally to all people, right? Well, with climate change, it's not true. You simply have different responsibilities. The responsibility of a rich person is very different than from a poor person living in India. Right? They are not the same when it comes to this problem. Also, we need to rethink just this whole idea of growth, right? All modern ideologies have growth as their goal, right? Every politician in the 20th century had an argument why with them we would have a better economy. Except that nowadays, just growth in itself, you cannot have endless growth and save the earth at the same time. So while we all want growth and we all want GDP to do better, we cannot keep wanting it forever, right? We need to rethink this. Also, we need to rethink just the fact that we place economics so central, right? In modern political thought, modern political fights are basically about the economy, right? Socialism versus neoliberalism is at the core of it an economic debate. But now we have other elements. Maybe there are things that are more important than the economy, right? It's a different way of thinking. Also, we need to rethink a bit how we deal with citizens. In modern political times, especially postmodern political times, it's all about what the government can do for people, right? Or it is about giving people freedom, one of both. But in any case, we have this kind of individualist idea of the government needs to increase your well-being or your freedom, right? But it's about politics helping you. In these times, it might make sense to quote Kennedy, right? To ask what you can do for your country, not just the other way around. Maybe we get to a time where the government would actually, where politics would need to ask things of people, right? We need to go beyond individualism. That's a different way of thinking about politics. And one of the more fundamental things that I haven't touched upon yet, and this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that is not talked about, is that in modern politics, whether it's communism or liberalism or fascism, we deal with problems by doing things. We're being invaded, we're going to send an army to stop the enemy, right? We don't have enough cars, we're going to build more cars. People are dying of old age because they don't have enough work, we're going to do pensions. We solve problems through action. That's what you want of politicians, right? That they're men of action, that they do things. Except that with climate change, a lot of the things you need to do are actually not doing things, right? As I showed you in my last slides, some of the biggest challenges are not in doing things, they're in not doing things. So this problem is as much about doing things, building technologies, as it is about showing restraint. And that is something that just doesn't compute with modern ideologies. They solve problems through action, not through inaction. But ecology brings that idea back. So there's a lot to think about, right? After your next exam. There's a lot to think about and to go over everything you learned so far in this course and all these ideologies and think, okay, but what does ecology do to them, right? And remember, at the end of the day, my final point, priority matters. It's very easy to say you're going to do things for the environment, but very few parties have this actually as their priority, right? So we need to actually properly make this thought exercise. Okay, I'm done talking. What are your questions? What can I explain better? And what critique do you have of the things I'm saying? Okay, monsieur. No comments or questions? Did you learn anything?
Okay, I have a comment rather than a question.
Mm-hmm.
This weekend, Javi, Elias, and me, we watched a movie that has to do something with our final project, and you will see that. But we learned that sometimes humans don't see other species as equal, and they see them like inferior, sorry. And that's what I think it's a big problem, I guess, because they don't take into account the importance other species have, like the like bugs, especially bees,
Mm-hmm.
as you already stated that in the first slides.
Okay. Well, yes, that can be true. The rhetorical good news is that the problem with climate change also works without caring about animals, right? It affects us directly enough to care about it, even if you don't care about other animals. Um, because the animal route, right, it is a very vulnerable route because you can make strong arguments that we are better than other animals. Um, you could, right? You could also argue against that. That's a debate. But I don't know if we need to have more empathy for animals to solve this. It would definitely help. That's for sure. Okay, thank you, Ms. Astrid, for introducing this. Any other comments that people have? My son is not happy about climate change. If you can hear him on the background.
I do have like a comment to further what Astrid was saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think that maybe like aside from having empathy for the existence of other creatures in the planet, um, maybe having basic understanding of the effects that other life has on the planet is important.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember when I first watched that documentary that touched upon the topic of meat, and I understood. But then when I tried to tell my parents and other people about it, they were like, "That doesn't make any sense. How is a cow going to have a bigger carbon footprint than another kind of industry?" So, like maybe being aware that, okay, yeah, we are the main producers of all this issue, but like animals as well, or the animals that we use for our consumption are also a big part of it, and actually drilling that into our heads to then actually be conscious of what we do with the meat and all of those products.
Yeah, a lot comes down to knowledge, right? I hope some of you learned a bit from this lecture, that I explained some things that well, you didn't already know. But yeah, a lot comes down to knowledge. I think most climate change denial comes out of very simple ignorance, um, which is not necessarily people's fault, but I think just understanding science a little bit more helps a lot. All right. if none of you have any complaints, questions, or remarks, and my son won't stop crying, then I will let you go, right? So next time, dear students, next time we're going to talk about robots. It will be scary. It will be kind of a Halloween episode. So I'll see you then, right? Okay, good luck and see you later. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Yep.
Thank you. Bye, teacher.